Laboratorio para la Ciudad is the experimental arm / creative think tank of the Mexico City government, reporting to the mayor. So basically the lab is composed of 20 people from very different fields, everything from urban geographers to artists, from data analysts to historians, artists, designers, etc., etc. And much of what we do is, first of all, think about what we think interesting visions for Mexico City, like how is this city that we imagine? And then what are the experiments that we can do at the lab to make the city that we imagine come true. Right now, we see cities going into really interesting spaces of sheer complexity. Many of the biggest challenges of the world, I think, find their place in cities. And these cities, just because of the population that they now have, where they used to be much smaller and now are becoming huge, as well as the place that cities have in terms of international agendas such as climate change, we're seeing that cities have to, in a way, be able to answer to these challenges. But from where do you enter the city? Where do you start these very complex conversations? How do you start understanding the interdependency of many things, where mobility has to do with housing, has to do with education, has to do with social mobility, has to do with public space, and I think that experimentation is basically the way of creating safe spaces around these questions. How do we think about questions that we need to ask the city? How do we come up with probable solutions? And then instead of thinking that we have the big answers and the plan from here to the next 10 years, how, besides having these strategies, do we figure out what the next precise steps are and be able to iterate and try different things in a safe space? And then once we know that we're going in the right direction, that these are the right answers, then we can hand over these experiments to other city agencies for them to be able to scale, or for other cities to also be able to copy the same type of projects, thinking about their own landscapes. So I do think that we need a compass. We need to know which way we're going in terms of every one of their experiments, and hence really thinking about the social and urban impact of these experiments, I think, is incredibly important. Now, that said, I do think that we're going the wrong way if we basically put these very weighty, very stodgy measurements that are more akin to other different fields upon the experiments, because we need to think about these as live processes. We need to think about emerging strategies. We need to know that maybe what we thought we were doing ends up being something completely different. And as long as we get to that social and urban reality that we're imagining, that is what I think is more interesting. So the way that we get there, I think, is up for grabs. We also have to be patient. We also have to learn how to fail, and to know that because, let's say, the impact of one part of the experiment is not necessarily what we were expecting, it does not mean that there's not another answer in the future. So how do we become agile and experimental, and at the same time think about those spaces where we can see if we're going in the right direction, is one of the big questions I think that labs are facing worldwide, but also the social sciences historically. How do you measure things that are multifactorial and that take on a life of their own? At the lab, we've seen that what we need to do is really think about the questions that each stage of the experiment is answering, as well as the larger provocation that it is part of, and then be able to see if it is going in the right direction with loosely and also specifically thought of methodologies depending on each experiment at hand. So at the beginning of the lab, I thought one of the biggest Achilles heels, both of my place in things as well as the team, was basically going to be the lack of experience in government, because out of 20 people, only 3 people from my team actually had prior experience in government. And funnily enough, it's actually been our strength. Why? First of all, because we interact with the rest of the government, which is basically a Mexico City bureaucracy composed of 280,000 people. So let's say that we already have enough people with experience in politics, and it's rather how do you come with fresh eyes, if you will, and how do you come with other paradigms, and then be able to incorporate the political side as well as the implementation side that government can be very good at, with these other methodologies, these other disciplines, these other actors, and come up with something that sits in between these two spaces. Experimental, generous, and transdisciplinary. A very specific advice would be your community is your strength. The more actors that you have involved, the more people that believe in your agenda, then it becomes a city conversation and a city project instead of a lab project or a government project. So bring in as many voices and people as you can. Be patient with those processes of participation because it does become a lot more sustainable in the long run.